Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the Murdoch media empire takes on the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Other organizations might rise and fall, but the BBC's income is guaranteed and growing.
At stake, the future of news on the World Wide Web, Sri Lanka, and the viral video that appears to be a war crime. We're looking at music and the media.
And now it's post 7/7. Why are they calling it that?
The Muslim rapper who says he's losing his religion to tomorrow's headlines. And some rockers from yesteryear with their take on television news.
Is there anybody in there? Is there anybody in there?
We begin this week with a tale of two media empires, one private and one publicly owned. Rupert Murdoch's News Corp is the world's biggest media company in private hands. It's valued at more than $50 billion. Its influence spans many countries. Britain's state-funded broadcaster, the BBC, is the world's largest news organization. This week, News Corp went after the BBC, as well as another important British institution, the country's broadcasting regulator, Ofcom. James Murdoch, the heir apparent to his father's company, accused the BBC and Ofcom of strangling private media in what he described as an unfair fight. Essentially, Murdoch asked, how can companies like News Corp charge web users for news content when state-subsidized news sites like the BBC's offer news on the web for free? That's our starting point this week. Two different visions of the future of media. What news should cost on the web, and the potential repercussions that these competing visions might have for news consumers everywhere.
Tonight, the gravest threat to the way we watch now was identified by the son of Rupert Murdoch as the vaulting ambition of the BBC.
Murdoch accused the BBC of crushing everything in its wake.
The BBC is dominant. Other organizations might rise and fall, but the BBC's income is guaranteed and growing.
Well, there's an agenda.
Is it rational for the authorities to try to manage the media industry in this way? Not at all.
It's a fight about the future of independent news journalism.
James Murdoch chose a television industry conference in Scotland to attack the BBC and the rules of the broadcasting game in Britain.
Why do I believe we need to change direction as a matter of urgency? It's quite simple. Because we have analog attitudes in a digital age.
And how to make money in the digital age is something News Corp and other media giants are still trying to figure out.
Rupert Murdoch, in the last few months, has issued a declaration that all of his online content to be paid for. He wants to make money from his digital businesses, which he's not doing at the moment. Both Murdochs believe that in the UK at least, to do that is very difficult because everything the BBC does, and it has a massive online presence, is free.
Nobody knows whether charging for online content will work. We know that there seems to be culturally now a view that on the internet everything is free, and that's kind of the point of it. There are many powerful people and knowledgeable people who believe that it's a complete no-hoper.
The Murdochs cannot afford to believe that. Their newspapers are losing money and need to find fresh revenue somewhere. News Corp owns or controls more than 170 newspapers worldwide, including The Wall Street Journal, The New York Post, The Times of London, The Australian, The Fiji Times. They even own a paper in Papua New Guinea. News Corp's revenue problems are global, and even if the corporation convinced the BBC to charge users for online content, that would not solve their revenue shortages elsewhere.
I think what we're seeing is countries around the world are watching the decoupling of news and advertising revenue and trying to figure out how they are going to save this institution of journalism.
News Corp also has huge broadcast holdings. Fox TV and Fox News in the US.
Fair, balanced, and accurate reporting.
Star TV and Star News in India. Sky TV and Sky News in the UK, to name just a few. Hence, James Murdoch's attack on Ofcom, Britain's broadcasting regulator.
Why did Murdoch target Ofcom? Well, surprise, surprise, Ofcom recently produced a report which suggested that actually in many of the services Sky delivers in this country, they are a dominant player, and that those services should be made available to other platforms. They don't like that, therefore you attack Ofcom.
However, the anti-monopoly argument is just part of it. In the US, Rupert Murdoch can and does use Fox News as a platform for his conservative views. In the UK, he can do the same with his newspapers, but Ofcom forbids ideologically driven news coverage on television or radio, and Murdoch's Sky News channel must play by those rules.
We should be honest about this. How, in an all-media marketplace, can we justify this degree of control in one place and not in others?
The broadcasting industry in Britain is traditionally quite heavily regulated, and that comes from, well, it comes from a tradition of, I suppose, what the Murdochs would call paternalism, but in Britain we might call responsibility.
James was very forthright in his attack on Ofcom and regulation in the British TV market. The question is, how far do you go? Many will be troubled by what they would see as a sort of an Americanization agenda in the UK with little or no regulation.
The effect of the system is not to curb bias. Bias is present in all news media, but simply to disguise it.
But the Murdochs don't even try to disguise their ideological bias. Case in point, the Iraq War.
Rupert, is there any agenda that you want to shape? For example, take the war. Have you shaped that agenda at all in terms of perceptions of the war, in terms of how the war is viewed?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've tried.
It just doesn't ring true, does it? I mean, if you look at the BBC, makes every effort it can to be an independent news organisation. The best example in recent years, of course, was the Iraq War, where the BBC tried to do balanced reporting.
Does the fact that George Bush and you are both Christians make it easier for you to view these conflicts in terms of good and evil?
The Murdoch operation tried to do none of that.
Talking Point supports Mr. Bush's position because there's no question that Saddam and others applaud terrorism.
Every Murdoch newspaper around the world supported the war, every single one.
Is it rational for the authorities to try to manage the media industry in this way? Not at all.
It was just one speech by Murdoch the Younger, but the battle lines have been drawn. This was not just about the future of online news, the role of the regulator, or the balance between private and public ownership. It was about more than that.
I think it's a broader fight. I think it's a fight about the role of the market. I think it's a fight clearly about public service television. It's a fight about the future of independent news journalism.
An element of regulation is a good thing. I think if you just leave it all to the market, your media is going to end up in a pretty dire state.
The only reliable, durable, and perpetual guarantor of independence is profit.
There must be a twofold solution, a private and a public media sector, and they both have to thrive. And if Murdoch has his way, it will all go into the hands of a few multinational media conglomerates that have proven time and time again that they don't do the kind of journalism that democracy requires.
Thank you.
Here's how our Global Village voices see the battle over news on the web.
It certainly seems ironic that James Murdoch should criticise the BBC for being a state-sponsored media monopoly crushing competition when Sky TV enjoys a virtual monopoly in satellite pay TV in the United Kingdom. And Sky TV has been nothing less than competitive when it comes to fighting for its rights, for example, with coverage of sports and other things.
James is the latest Murdoch to demonstrate a complete lack of online awareness. His attempts to criticise the UK media's regulatory framework by using the example of the BBC's freely disseminated online news content demonstrates that James doesn't quite understand the concept of the World Wide Web.
If you'd like to be one of our Global Village voices, there are multiple ways to let us know. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net, or just go on Facebook and look for the Listening Post page. We've got more than 1,300 fans signed up who track us there. You can also follow us on Twitter. We will keep you posted via Facebook and Twitter on what stories we're working on and how you can add your voice to the mix. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Back in February, we reported on the war in Sri Lanka and how the government in Colombo locked most of the media out of the war zone. Video has now surfaced that has people asking how bad things got there. This footage shows what looks like government soldiers executing bound and naked men, shooting them in the back of the head. Video also shows more bodies lying in pools of blood. The video, which appears to have come from a mobile phone, came to light through a group called Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka and has aired on British and Indian television. The Sri Lankan government has categorically denied that its troops were involved in any war crimes during their offensive on Tamil rebels. It has challenged the authenticity of the video. The government said, quote, "We have seen many cases where unverified video and photographers have been used to undermine Sri Lanka," unquote. And still with that country, here's a story about what happens to journalists who fail to toe the government's line in Sri Lanka. The Tamil editor of the Northeastern monthly magazine, J.S. Tissanayagam, has been sentenced to 20 years in prison. Tissanayagam was convicted by the country's high court of causing communal disharmony and receiving money from the Tamil Tiger rebel group to pay for his website. The sentence has come under some heavy criticism. The International Federation of Journalists called it, quote, "brutal and inhumane," unquote, and said that the Sri Lankan authorities are abusing anti-terror laws to silence peaceful critics. Earlier this year, U.S. President Barack Obama cited Tissanayagam as an example of Sri Lankan journalists facing intimidation or arrest for their professional work. Serbia, which was a tough place for journalists to work during the Milosevic years, seems to be rolling back the clock on freedom of the press. The parliament there has passed a law that will make any newspaper guilty of libel pay fines ranging up to a week's worth of sales. Electronic media will have their fines pegged to commercial revenues. The new law was written with Serbia's tabloid papers in mind. They frequently target government ministers for alleged wrongdoings. But the fear is that the law is worded in such a vague way that it could have a chilling effect on all forms of news media, not just the tabloids that have flourished in the post-Milosevic era. Know your audience. That's an adage that applies throughout the media world, including in advertising. So one has to wonder just what Microsoft was thinking when it photoshopped this ad. Here's the original that went out in the US. Here's the version that was published for the Polish market, in which an African American was replaced by a Caucasian. Microsoft has since apologized and said it will take the ad down. And it wasn't even a good photoshopping job. If you look closely enough, you'll see that the man's face was replaced, but his hand was not. That Iraqi journalist who threw a pair of shoes at George W. Bush last year will be out of jail soon. Muntadar al-Zaidi was initially sentenced to 3 years for his air mail message to the former president. Then the sentence was reduced to 1 year, and if he is indeed released September 14th, as his lawyer now reports, he will have served just about 9 months. Al-Zaidi became a bit of a folk hero in Iraq and the Arab world for what he did, although it was clearly a breach of diplomatic protocol, not to mention journalistic objectivity. We're back after the break with a piece about the media, Islamophobia, and one musician's response to the problem.